when the COVID crisis hit, it was clear that there would be enormous challenges, especially given the state of digital readiness, particularly in Switzerland. That was clear, I think, to most people, but maybe not so publicly visible. Personally, I decided at the time to focus on not necessarily inventing new infrastructure, because the time just wasn't there, but to see if one can develop technology in a very short amount of time that can have a potential impact. And I will briefly talk about this. Don't want to go too much into the details, but it's only insofar as I think it's relevant to the topic of sharing without sharing. So what I find really interesting, right, about this title is that when you sort of rephrase it a little bit, it's a very catchy title and a very good one. What I'm reading here is that you want to reach a certain goal, whatever that is. And you want to do that while ensuring that you don't accidentally put a lot of sensitive data into the hands of organizations that shouldn't have their hands on that data. That, to me, is sort of the more precise, but not so catchy way of thinking about sharing without sharing. And in that sense, I think there's a lot of lazy thinking in the system about that. That there is often not actually a very clear thinking process around what is the actual goal. And there is also not so much thinking about what data do I really need to reach that goal. Oftentimes, what I discovered myself is that the goal is just to make sure that eventually you can create some kind of value. And the best way to do that, if you don't have a plan, is just to collect a lot of data ahead of time and then figure it out on the way. That's fine, that can work as a model, but I would consider that a sort of lazy thinking model. And again, it may work in many situations, but it didn't work for the particular case of the pandemic. And that's, of course, not a black and white issue. I mean, it's clear, right? If you have a certain goal, you need some data, then that's fine. But there is a balancing act that is required, and it's also required, I think, from the population increasingly. In the same way that you do research on animals or humans, people are asking, right, why you're doing this, and they're asking if there's not enough, and what data really do you need, right? What experiments do you really need to do? And eventually you can go quite far in doing human or animal experiments, but the further you want to go, the more intense this research is, the more you have to convince people that there is no other way of doing it, right? This is a very common, as you know, everyone who's ever filled in an IRB proposal knows that's the key question, right? Is there not another way? And that's, not lazy thinking. So I want to share 4 lessons, and these are essentially the lessons that I hope, can inspire you also throughout the day, which is that pragmatism wins at the end of the day, but will get no love. And by love, I mean, general appreciation. It's possible that it's a business win, but it's not appreciated broadly. And this is not to say, oh, it's not appreciated, but it's actually to say it's hard to lock that in, because something that's not appreciated will very quickly fade away unless it's technologically locked in. Right? If people don't appreciate privacy as much as they think they do or they say they do, then privacy will go down the drain unless you lock it in with technology. What I learned is that privacy concerns are not where you think they are, and here I'm pointing the you at me, but maybe you'll find the same thing. I'll talk about this. In this particular COVID pandemic, I realized that the media was mostly of no help. You would think it would be, right? If you open the newspaper, there are all these concerns about privacy, but when it comes down to it, you realize that's not the objective, right? The objective is to have good stories, and if there's good privacy in a product, then the good story is to argue that there's possibly not good privacy. And then also surveys are of limited use. That's sort of the notion of how much privacy do people actually want versus how much do they say they want. Now, I need to spend some time in explaining how this technology works and why we did it, right? It's sort of the non-lazy thinking part that we try to do ahead of the game. So as you know, the number one reason why we're even talking about this damn virus is that it has this capacity of transmitting itself to the next person, from A to B, while A has absolutely no clue yet that they even have it. If it wasn't for that, right, we wouldn't be talking about it. Most likely we wouldn't be talking about it. Most viruses don't have that property. And so we can just go after people who show symptoms and then, isolate them, end of the story. And that's how so far we managed to dodge the bullet on many of these things, particularly, as an example, SARS-1. And this one, obviously now SARS-2, has that unfortunate property that it does pre-symptomatically transmit. So that has severe implications, right? Because the implications is that if you want to stop this thing, which we now anyways agree that we can't, but you still want to slow it down, right? So as to not overwhelm your system, you have to be faster than you usually are, because you can't just go and cut the links between symptomatic people and their contacts because it's too late. But you have to actually cut them from people who don't know yet that they have it. And this is where contact tracing comes in. Because if that's your contact network, right, and you have a person here in the middle that is now transmitting but has no clue that he or she is transmitting, then few days later, he or she may have transmitted that to other people who eventually become transmitters themselves. Now, if you just say, oh, here's a symptomatic person, let's put that person in isolation. I mean, I don't have to do this any further, but you know where this goes, right? This is, you're always behind. And the trick is to identify these other people so you can put them in precautionary isolation, aka quarantine. Now, the way we thought about this system is to say, okay, imagine Alice, right? So user story, Alice has, many contacts. Of course, she's a social person like we all are. She goes about her life, across the time axis. Eventually, she gets infected somewhere. It doesn't matter now for the purpose of this example. But eventually, she gets contagious there. And then a couple of days later, she becomes symptomatic. So now the classical, she's responsible, of course, she isolates. The classical contact tracing sets in. She gets called by a contact tracer and to figure out who are the contacts. In the world that we imagine is she would also have this contact tracing app, or call it here PT for proximity tracing. What that would then do is you basically go back in time, right? You ask, okay, who were the contacts? So you can then contact them and put them in quarantine. And now you have two systems, so you have some redundancy there. So some people get contacted in both ways. Some people only get contacted the classical way. Some people get contacted only the new way. Unfortunately, you're going to miss some. But those you don't miss, again, you assume they're responsible, they do their job, their contribution, which means staying at home in quarantine. Some of them indeed will have been infected. And this is where you cut the transmission chains, right? One you're missing, but again, now you have reduced your reproduction number of that virus quite substantially. Now, this idea was around for some time, but it was also in the scientific literature, specifically for SARS-CoV-2 very early on. This science paper by the Fraser Group in the UK, which really showed this quite nicely. I think I saw a first preprint already in January 2020. It came out a little later. But still, there was even a shiny app that you could sort of play with the parameters. This is also the paper that unfortunately, and that's not the fault of the paper, but it caused this misunderstanding that people thought 60% of the population needs to use this for this to work. But at that time, right, there were no apps, there was no operating system support. You couldn't actually do this thing on any Apple device because Apple wouldn't allow you to do Bluetooth scanning in the background while the app is asleep. You can't do that on the operating system. And there was no data to bring that home. So we, like many other groups, we developed a protocol, and I'll explain that because this is where the question comes in, right? What is your goal and what data do you need? So we said, okay, the goal is actually to inform people, right? The goal is to find people and encourage them to go into quarantine. That's the epidemiological goal, so that you can cut these transmission chains. So the idea would be that these phones basically broadcast their presence and making small, obviously extreme simplifications here. This is cryptographically quite sophisticated, but let's just talk about A. So then A, comes in contact with the phone B in somewhat in proximity, 2-ish meters for a specific amount of time, and then both phones make a record of that interaction on their phone. And then down the line, the phone of person A comes in contact with the phone of person C, and again later, there's a person D, and so on. So now, right here we said, okay, we're collecting all this data, but actually we should continuously delete it because it's sensitive data. And we want to make sure that the system itself is secure, so IDs are ephemeral, everything stays on the device, right? We don't collect any other information. And of course we do all of this in an open source way. Now the critical debate, and this became a European and eventually to some extent even a global debate, but I think in Europe this was really the main debate, is what do you do now if a person gets sick? So person A, right, has been using this app, and now eventually, unfortunately, they have a positive COVID test. So there were two models, by and large, that were proposed. One is what I call the central model. In the central model, you say, well, easy, right? We know that A was in contact with B, C, and D. Well, the phone knows. So we should ask the phone to upload this information, that B and C and D were potential contacts. And then we can ping P, C, and D and tell them, you should really go in quarantine, and here's the process. This looks like a very natural model because, you ping B, C, and D, problem solved. The problem with that model, though, even though it does reach your goal, is that now you're centrally collecting sensitive information, right? In this particular case, you would know that B, C, and D had contact with someone else. And as you collect this data, which is contact network data, you can derive, complex contact network information, and you can then repurpose that information. And this is fairly sensitive data, right? I mean, we're talking about someone, going somewhere where maybe they shouldn't be, and then, go to a bar maybe where they shouldn't go, and then the next morning go to a religious institution that wouldn't appreciate the bar the night before, and so on. I mean, there's all kinds, right, of very sensitive information that can be collected. And in particular, also, as the user, once that information is out, right? For A, it's fine, but think about the fact that you're B, C, and D. I mean, eventually, right, someone knows in a central authority that you had contact with some of these people, or that you're part of that network. And there's no way for you to ever say, I don't want that. Unless, of course, you don't download the app, but then you don't reach the goal. So we proposed an alternative model, and we said, okay, let's do this decentrally. And the trick in the decentral model is to say, let us not do the obvious thing of uploading B, C, and D, but let us just upload the fact that A is sick. And then what we have to do is something that's not very efficient, which is we have to inform all the phones, right? Potentially millions or hundreds of millions of phones that A has been sick. That is clearly not very efficient from a bandwidth perspective, but from a privacy preservation perspective, it is quite good, because now the phones themselves can check, is A in my list? So you see, the logic is now not on the side of the server, but it's on the side of the phone. The phone checks whether it should be alerted. And so that's really great, right, from a privacy perspective, because the contact data stays on the device. And so the decision about this alert is made locally and not on a central server. And the server indeed knows nothing other than who was infected. And that's, we didn't consider that critical information or privacy sensitive information because the person already had contact with the healthcare system, got a test and so on, right? The system in some sense already know that person A is sick. And then of course you continuously delete the data as well, but you can of course also do that in the central model. Now, we called this decentralized privacy preserving proximity tracing. Originally, we developed this as a group of many researchers from European countries. All of a sudden, early, let's say late March, we got this really severe rift in that group, which at the time was called PEP-PT, where we realized, many of us want to go decentralized because it's the better way. And there were other people that said, no, we should absolutely go centralized. And this really became quite bizarre. I mean, to the point that, we had calls with government officials that eventually told us, the chancellor has decided and the prime minister has decided. And we said, okay, I mean, we haven't even discussed this in detail. Of course, none of that mattered because what mattered eventually was what Google and Apple decided. To the great shock of some politicians, decisions were made by technology companies. To the great relief of us, they chose this technology. But this became actually the biggest sort of drama then in the following weeks and months, is that many rejected this technology, not because they thought the technology itself was bad, but because Google and Apple decided something that they thought public health should decide. Most famously, the French. France really said, okay, we don't want to go with that model, and largely on the ground that it shouldn't be the tech companies that decide what is the good technology. And I have full sympathy with this argument, right? It just wasn't necessarily very pragmatic at the point. Other countries, the Swiss were among the first who said, okay, we're going to do this the decentralized way. This was, good from a public, from a sort of public marketing perspective. Germany, after some open discussions and criticism from some privacy actors, switched to the decentralized model. And then countries sort of one by one flipped over in Europe, and now every European country except France uses this model because it is part now of the operating system, right? Apple and Google came along and said, well, we looked at the different models and we decided to use the DP3T approach. And this is now in your phone, right? It's the exposure notification framework, which you can decide to not use, of course, but it is part now of your operating system. And I can't possibly say for how long. It worries me as well, right, to a certain extent, that actually, if now Google and Apple decides, hey, we should keep this for the flu or for something else, then it's them who are going to decide, and that's clearly not a good thing. But it's, I wouldn't know exactly what to do about that. In the crisis, at least, I felt good that we didn't contribute to a large data collection effort that could have gone wrong. You've seen sometimes in other countries that tried the other way, that now this data is used, for example, for policing efforts, right? That some governments collected centralized data for public health, and now it's also used for other purposes. Does it work? Yes, it does work. In Switzerland, unfortunately, we don't have the infrastructure to measure this. We did in the summer 2020. Because the thing is, right, what's hard about this, and this is why none of my colleagues wanted it. So I was in a actually somewhat difficult position because all my epidemiological colleagues said, this is not how we should do, right? Because they're scientists, they want more data. And they felt not so great about some of us arguing for less data. Now I think that the views have changed, but at the time it was actually quite difficult. But the problem is that when you do any type of epidemiological study, you access a type of data source and then you do your analysis. Here you don't have the data, so how do you actually figure out whether this system was effective? You need to develop a whole new framework of assessing efficacy in the case of decentralized systems. And it's not easy. But what you need is, right, so once a person gets an alert and they go to the public health system and say, hey, I received a notification, what should I do? Well, now this person is back in the system and you can ask them questions and they're obviously ready to answer it most of the time because they're coming to you. And now you can sort of estimate the efficacy. But you need to collect that data. And in Switzerland, that happened in the summer. But in the second wave, the system was so overwhelmed very quickly that everyone just stopped collecting that data. As a consequence is we will never know how well the system works because we don't have the data because it was not collected. Our colleagues in the UK, even though they switched relatively late to the decentralized protocol, when they did it right. And they developed this NHS COVID-19 app, which is very sophisticated because you can also you can schedule your test, that you get the test result on the app. It's very well done using the exposure notification protocol. And the NHS, also unlike Switzerland, the NHS was actually extremely supportive. So the government was extremely supportive of the app, promoted the app, and had the corresponding infrastructure to collect the relevant data around it. So again, the group of Christoph Fraser managed actually to really get detailed analysis on how well this technology works. And what they found, and this is a Nature paper from earlier this year, is that roughly speaking, for every percentage use of the app in the second wave, this analysis is limited to the second wave, although I assume there will be more, you prevent 1% of the cases, right? And you don't necessarily need to be an advanced mathematician to sort of go one step further and think, what would that have meant if, large parts of the population would indeed have adopted this technology? And I hope it will influence the discussions around this technology for the next pandemic. But 1% usage, 1% reduction of cases. I would say, right, if anyone would have claimed this at the time, they would have been called crazy. And now we have the data to demonstrate this, and data is also coming out from Germany, from Finland, and from other countries, that this technology, if it's done properly, works really well. Good. So now that you understand a bit how this technology works, I want to reflect a little bit on what the learnings are from this rather unusual experience. And I came across this quote, which I quite like, even though I have to say, right, nowadays I do 95% of my life is trying to do strategical things. But it's really, right, you have to be extremely pragmatic to do something like this operationally in an extremely short time. And the problem with that is that you will be faced with trade-offs, as always in life, when you do something difficult. That's why it's usually difficult, because there's a trade-off. And in this case, the trade-off, of course, was between privacy and health. And here, what I call lazy thinking is if you just sort of accept the fact that there's this trade-off, and this is roughly what the shape of this trade-off looks like, because it's the most simple shape you can think of. And the sort of natural, almost fallback thought is we just need data, right, to solve the problem. And then, well, of course, that reduces your privacy, but it increases potentially your epidemiological impact. The idea, right, is to really not do lazy thinking and really try to see, can this curve be bent in this direction? Because if you can bend it in this direction, then you can find a space, a point on this curve, right, where you can say, you know what, this is a pragmatic solution. This is an acceptable privacy risk, and it also gives us a good epidemiological impact. Now, what you, of course, note here is that it's not perfect, right? It's pragmatic, but it's not perfect. And, of course, then you will get attacked from exactly both of these fields for exactly not being perfect in their particular area. And this is exactly what happened in this particular instance. that there was massive attack from the privacy community that said, this is not a good privacy preserving solutions. I mean, there were professors, right, experts in privacy who wrote many papers why this is not a good privacy solution, and certainly not the best there is. And there were many people that argued, this doesn't give us the best possible epidemiological impact, right? Why would you propose such a solution? And that's really the crux also, I think, of interdisciplinary work, which we all agree is kind of the future of science. But unless we solve these kinds of problems, it's going to be tough. The second point that I mentioned is that privacy concerns are not where you think they are. So I was quite naive at the time, right? And I thought, okay, here's a privacy-preserving solution. People love privacy, so people will love this solution. And of course, we saw, right, millions of examples where that just didn't happen, right? I mean, famously, right, I think you all have seen similar things, but this funny way of using highly non-privacy preserving technologies to argue something about the privacy preserving technology that's not true. And this was a major issue for us. Swiss COVID, like any other exposure notification app, cannot know your location by design. But that wasn't known to many people, even though we didn't stop, saying it. Suddenly, there were concerns in the parliament, Swiss parliament of all places, where some politicians asked, why does Swiss COVID use Amazon? Right? Remember this graph where I said we have to share this information with millions of phones? Well, you don't want some second-rate government server to do that, right? You want an infrastructure that does that extremely efficiently, and that was Amazon in this case, which acted as a content delivery network, which is true, by the way, for almost all government services in Switzerland. And that actually has been an official tender, right, many years ago, and it's great. This is why your weather reports and so on, everything is very fast and responsive, is because there's a professional CDN. But all of a sudden, right, there were some people in politics that weren't aware of that. And, I don't blame them. I'm just saying, right, these are sort of the dynamics that you're not necessarily preparing for, where that became a sort of critical stumbling block, and the Federal Department of Interior Affairs even needed to get out the technical leaflet explaining that this is not an issue. But to this day, right, I get many people who say, I would really have loved to download Swiss COVID, but this thing with Amazon, right, I don't like Jeff Bezos, and so it's too tricky for me. I can't use it. If you use another server, then I start using it. Would have never predicted this in a million years, right? That there's this sensitivity / misunderstanding. And again, I'm not saying people are not smart for having these misunderstandings, because it's not trivial, right? It's not trivial actually to think that Amazon just acts as a content delivery network. What does that even mean? Most people wouldn't understand. There were some things where I thought, wow, okay, I didn't see this coming in 100 years. But there was criticism that the open source code of this application was hosted on GitHub, and GitHub is owned by Microsoft. So therefore, you are a GAFA application. So I didn't see this coming, and especially not coming from privacy experts. But here's a post from Le Temps, right, where a privacy expert says, right, Swiss code is not open source, which is not true, right? All elements of Swiss code are open source, except the part in the operating system. We're really sorry, right? We couldn't convince Apple and Google to open source their operating system, but all parts of Swiss code are open source. Yes, the source code is hosted by GitHub. And the protocol is, of course, controlled by whoever controls the phones. And yes, we use a CDN of Amazon because that's what the Swiss government does. But therefore, this is GAFAM COVID. And it's really hard to argue this against this. I mean, you can, but obviously, if people who are trusted in the community or have the corresponding credentials say, this is really bad because this is a GAFA product, then it's hard to get this out of the heads. Also the role that the media played, again, there I also thought, well, okay, I mean, the media is always banging on, how bad the companies are about privacy preserving. So here comes a privacy preserving technology. Surely they will just say good things about that. Okay, another naive assumption, right? There were many situations like this where when the app came out, this is prime TV, right? 7:30 in the evening at a time where everybody watches these shows because everyone's sort of wondering what the hell is going on. And people were asked, "Did you download this app?" And the person said, "Of course I did not download the app. I mean, I don't want the government to know where I go." End of message, right? No clarification that, but the government does not know where you go because it doesn't collect this information. It's just, right, these things were just left there because it created that outrage, and we all know the sort of dynamics, right, that we're now seeing in the media. I was on, my most bizarre thing, head scratcher, was where I was on Swiss-Italian TV for an interview, a 1-hour show, and there was an engineer that got about 10 minutes of prime time to demonstrate that if he puts a phone somewhere and then he goes across the street 80 meters, he can still measure the Bluetooth signal of that phone. I mean, right? I mean, I don't want to be disrespectful, but it's, you can assume, right, that some engineers have heard about that fact as well, and that there's ways to figure out whether a device is at 2 meters or at 80 meters. And last but not least, I still sort of felt, okay, but the surveys, right, the surveys say that people really love privacy-preserving technology. And actually, just Googling also last night just to see, I wonder what's actually today. I mean, still, this just came out 2 days ago, actually. Apparently, the Swiss population trusts Swiss COVID app and the certificate, which I think you all use, more than pretty much any other app or digital service, with the exception of banks. I don't know if you have banks here, but congratulations. And Behörden, so government administration, which is kind of interesting given that most people who said they don't want to use Swiss COVID is because they felt the government would have information about them, but So you can see, right, all the others are not trusted, but you can of course see that all the others are highly used, right? Yeah, I mean, email, right, online shops, chats, messenger, search engines. I mean, everybody uses it, but they're not trusted. And so I don't know what this graph should actually tell us, but I think we have, this graph puzzles me, right? How is it possible that the things that are most trusted are to some extent the least used? And last but not least, because at the time, right, this was May, right, so this was shortly before the launch of the app. This was a survey from University of Zurich, so this was done properly and scientifically and so on. And what this says is that in the knowledge that a tracking app collects data on location for people, which is not true, but even in that knowledge, 72% would still say they would use the app. Right. And we know, of course, what happened. I mean, the exact opposite happened. At the most use of the app, 25-ish% use the app. So it's right. This information sort of asking people, would you use something if it had certain privacy properties, is not predictive at all of what people want. So this sort of sums it up a little bit. So I hope these thoughts were helpful. I mean, I wish, you know, I could present you with a list, like learnings, you know, therefore we need to do this. But I must admit, this is still a big head scratcher for me, and I don't quite know how to deal with it. Now, sometimes people ask, okay, if you know, knowing all of this and sort of, you know, having your classical time machine and going back, would you still do it that way? Well, I think we still should, because of course we could say, okay, you know what? Actually, people don't care as much about privacy as we think they do. So let's build this other system. But I don't think that would actually be good, because at the end of the day, somehow I'm still clinging to this graph, and I'm thinking, you know, maybe there's also just ways of what happened in the past 5 to 10 years where people just realize what a threat privacy can be, that once we do something like this and it slowly dawns on people that this was actually really a good and trustworthy technology, then maybe the next time something like this come around, the trust will be there, right? And we just didn't have the trust at the time, because everybody who said they were doing privacy-preserving technology often ended up not doing privacy-preserving technology. And so who were we just to come and say, oh, but this is, you can trust us. But maybe now, right, that we delivered, and as you know, there hasn't been a single problem with this technology, because there can't in the technology. Maybe next time this happens, there will be this remembering, right, and say, okay, there is actually privacy-preserving technology that we can trust. And I'm certainly happy to also see, at least in Swiss politics, that whenever there is now a discussion about, you know, EID or whatever, right, the next digital project is, people almost reflectively sort of use the decentral argument, not always necessarily in the best way, but at least, right, there's this reckoning now that we can do some of these things in privacy-preserving ways, and maybe we should in the future. But, you know, that's my hope. Thank you very much.